Neat. Hello. All right. Um, Nagaashkaa, Nibi, Miinwaa, Miikan. Damming the water and the path of Lake Sturgeon in the Ottawa River watershed. All right. Yeah, my name's Finn. I grew up near the Kuchazibi, the Ottawa River, both north and south of it. It raised me, the beings within it, and the being that it is raised me. Um, yeah, and I feel great responsibility towards this river, and this project was a great example of that, and to show that and to exercise that. Omami Wanina presence. So Omami Wanina is also known as Algonquin. Um, they've been along the Kichizibi for thousands of years. Um, the Ottawa River, the Kichizibi, is like a highway for the Omami Wanina, and it was a highway for many other nations as well. But the Omami Wanina were really like the gatekeepers of this highway, and you think of that highway as kind of running from this linkage between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, and then the rest of the interior of Turtle Island. So it was a really important kind of hub, I guess you could say. And yeah, I believe these are the right holders of this land, like the inherent right holders of this land. They carry the rights to, relate to this land in the deep way and carry out ceremony and praise the water and the land. And that shouldn't be impeded in any way. And this is not a judicial or legal right. This is a right given by the Creator. So here's just a map of contemporary, like modern Omami Wanina presence and communities. Important of note, close to the Kichizibe would be Pikwakanagan, and Nipissing and Kitaganzibi. They're kind of closely related to what has happened. People, in those communities are closely related to what has happened along the Kichizibe. But I like all these other communities are as well. Western presence along the Kichizibe, it's pretty big story to it, and I don't want to get into it too much in the respective time. But I think what's important to know is basically, 1600s and 1700s involved a lot of British and French kind of relationships, whether they were positive or negative. It was kind of just tumultuous, and it kind of resulted in a lot of displacement and a lot of broken promises. But by the 1800s, logging really started to come in kind of after the War of 1812. Logging really started to boom along the Kichizibe and up its tributaries, and it kind of followed where the logging would come in, and then settlement would follow logging, and then sickness would follow that. And that really decimated a lot of the populations of the Omami Wanina. For example, around Lake Temiskaming, Omami Wanina presence dropped from 77% to 3% just in 30 years, from 1971 to 1901. Logging really affected the land. It brought sickness to the land itself too. So, there's that inherent connection between the people and the land there, and it's personified through this example. Then damming started to take shape. Here's a kind of a little overview of some of the dams that you'll find going from Lake Temiskaming down towards Ottawa. Chaudière Falls is where Ottawa is. So we'll get into the dams. Yeah, damming the Ottawa River. It started with logging to change water levels, but in the turn of the 1900s, hydroelectricity really started to become present. Um, and first, it was a privately run thing, and reservoirs were built to control flow. But then around the war in the 1940s, the provincial governments got heavily involved, and they started to really build a lot of dams along the Ottawa River, um, which there was a lot of disputes over, you know, jurisdiction and power over the Ottawa River because it's transboundary. Um, but in the end, there was a agreement made where it was just divvied up, kind of like half and half between the two provincial governments. And by 1983, 43 dams um, built along the Ottawa River basin were generating $1 million worth of electricity a day. And there was this board, the ORRPB, made the board made to regulate the flow and just communication across provinces around power generation from the river. But yeah, the big problem with damming is, sure, it makes you money, but it really messes with the ecology of the Kuchisibi. And a noteworthy species that we're going to go into is the Name, the lake sturgeon. The lake sturgeon holds within it so many teachings, which I'm still kind of trying to gather and understand. But yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of teachings how it's, or not a lot, but I've heard how there's a relation between the sturgeon and the sky world and the Anangosak, the stars. And there's also this feeling, I guess, that the sturgeon is like very much an elder, where it has these very old teachings that's carried with it, and that kind of aligns with the fact that it's a living fossil. Um, you know, its genetics can be dated back to almost 52 million years ago. You know, it hasn't changed that much genetically in that much amount of time, which I find is it's like hard to wrap your head around. Yeah, it holds great wisdom, and there's a list here of all these amazing things that it provides for the Omami Winina and other nations as well. I took some of these from other nations, and I just assumed that Omami Winina would also kind of relate it in these similar ways. Nagaashkaa Name Miikan. So that's the stopping of the sturgeon path. So yeah, damming has really negatively affected sturgeon populations through water levels, through migrations, through stopping, embryo development and spawning grounds, logging, tradition like early logging and contemporary logging has also really affected that with, roads being built over tributaries and effluent, pulp and paper contaminants, and it's just, it all has really messed with this population, and the Name have a really close linkage with an endangered mussel called the hickory nut that exists in the Ottawa River Basin. And what's interesting about this mussel is actually it's a huge filtration system for the Ottawa River. So thinking about this kind of reciprocity that this fish has in relation to this river, how without this fish you don't have your filtration system, and without your filtration system, do we have a river that can support us? Yeah, so I mentioned the right holders, the Omami went in it earlier. They have their right to their sturgeon and their food and their lifeways, but it's being impacted. But who's gaining from this? The stakeholders. I mean, there's been such great economic gain in the past. Hydro-Quebec and Ontario Power Generation is gaining so much presently and probably planning on gaining a lot in the future. And it's just interesting thinking about that moving forward. And invasives and climate change issues like warming of waters also are affecting the populations. Thinking about responsibility, who's responsible for the severance of relationship? Well, yeah, who built the dams is the question. The severance, that breaking the connection. That is who I think is responsible. Is who built the dams, and thinking about accountability is going back to that. But also, in terms of moving forward with that accountability, I would just want to bring up the wampum belt that William Commanda Bunn would carry, and just the teaching around this belt being the seventh fire wampum belt, and how it is for multiple nations, whether it's settler or non-settler, indigenous populations, to come together and use teachings based in the land that we live on and move forward collaboratively. This is like a prophetic wampum, and I believe it's what we're living right now, but it's also what we're figuring out. And it's kind of a choice we do need to make, being that collaboration. And I think we all have a responsibility to collaborate in that way. Jurisdictional responsibility. I think Kichizibi and Omami, when in a territory, at least in the Canadian state's eyes, is transboundary. So, as I mentioned, Ontario, Quebec, kind of exists in a mix along both these kind of this territory and this river, and there's a lot of problems with that. I guess I'll leave it at that. But yeah, moving forward, I think I love the idea that William Commanda brought up, and there's still ongoing disputes about it, but freeing the Chaudière Falls and kind of relieving the stress that is put on top of this sacred site. Like traditionally it was a sacred site, where of gathering and of ceremony, and now it's a massive dam, and it's full of industrial buildings and such. So I think that would be a beautiful place to start, is to rectify that. And then biologists in this paper were recommending fisheries be altered in some way. There's certain reservoirs up the tributaries that are affecting the sturgeon populations quite a lot. And then there's an extensive recovery plan done by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources with 4 main objectives that I won't go into detail right at the moment. But they say in their report that they want Aboriginal perspectives to be like a part of the plan, and an important part of the plan. So, it's hopeful, but these objectives are in summary, they're all quite population based and scientific based, and there's not an idea of how they're actually, I guess, thinking about what the sturgeon has to teach and what the sturgeon has to give. It's more just like a population-based study, I guess, and a recovery plan based on that. Oh, yeah. So challenges, I guess sources were actually quite prevalent for a lot of things, like the history and the genetic and ecological research. Um, I found traditional teachings and like actual, you know, like I definitely would have loved to come across more traditional teachings around Name, um, specifically around Omame Winene teachings. Um, and yeah, I found it pretty sad to find it next to impossible to find a name for the mussel or mussels in general, but I couldn't find a name for hickory nut. And I just wondered, like, wow, is this? I wonder if, and if anyone knows the name for hickory nut and other mussels. And I just got thinking about that sort of thing, like what is lost in all these severances of relationships. Anyway, miigwech, chimiigwech, kinagoya. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience. I really tried to rush that. I realized that was a lot of research. Okay, thank you. Here's my references.